we're lucky to have an extremely prompt crowd today. So even though it's only 2 minutes past the hour, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. To everybody that has joined us, thank you. First of all, my name is Kelly Barner. I am the General Manager at Art of Procurement. What you're joining us for today is a mastermind community category briefing. We do a couple of these a month on different specific categories that are of interest to the community. One note about that, if there's ever a category that you're interested in, we've done corrugated, we've done facility services, and of course today we're doing logistics. But please do let us know if there's a specific category that you would like to see us feature. But today we have a very timely category and one that I'm super excited about. We have Margaret Tedley with us today. She's with ProcureAbility. She's a director of advisory services. And I'm going to have her introduce herself in a moment. But before I do, a little something about today's format. We have a couple different kinds of sessions here at Art of Procurement Mastermind. Some of them are roundtables and learning workshops where everybody joins like a Zoom meeting and can talk and shares video and everything. This is more of a webinar format. We have quite a few folks with us on the phone. And so this is going to be more of the traditional. If you have comments, if you have questions, please go ahead and submit those through the chat or Q&A feature that you should be able to see. I'll be monitoring those, so both are completely fine. Do whichever is easiest for you based on the device or type of screen that you're using. We will start with a little bit of an intro, and then Margaret's going to give us an overview of the category. I'll probably break in here and there to ask some questions, either yours or mine. And then we'll have more of a dedicated Q&A period at the end where I will run through audience questions. So don't hesitate to ask those questions at any point that you have them. If I can break in, I will. If not, we will get to as many as we can right at the end. So with that, Margaret, thank you so much for joining us. Could I ask you to start by just introducing yourself briefly to our audience, provide them with a little bit of background on yourself, and maybe tell us why logistics is your category?
You bet. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear just fine.
Okay. Well, good morning and good afternoon to those on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us today. I'm looking forward to talking to you about some of the wild trends in logistics these days and sharing some strategies that are helping companies cope and even thrive. We'll take a look at a couple of macro trends and how they're affecting the major modes of transportation. And then we'll talk about 4 areas that get to the heart of logistics strategy. Okay, sorry, just got to get my mouse going right here. First, just a bit about me and my company. As Kelly said, I'm a director in ProcureAbility's advisory group. ProcureAbility has been around for 25 years. Everything we do is procurement or supply chain related. We have a variety of category experts in advisory, which is our consulting group. We have direct and indirect procurement experts, as well as logistics, P2P, contract management, etc. I've been consulting in supply chain for over 25 years, working with large and Fortune 500 companies like FedEx, Coca-Cola, PG&E, Crocs, Petco, to name a few of the more familiar names. While my focus has always been procurement and supply chain operations, I've worked across a wide variety of industries. Utilities, food, manufacturing, chemicals, retail, really any that are working, any large shipper with a physical, supply chain that's shipping physical goods. Supply chain has always been interesting to me, but these days it's like an unbelievably real action movie. Okay. All right, so let's dive right into today's topic. We'll start with a discussion of the disruptions over the last year and some of the trends that have resulted. Of course, last year brought wild volatility to markets in general, and the impact on logistics has been profound. Today, we'll take a look at a couple trends affecting overall logistics, and then consider the trends that have been tossing around carriers in each major mode of transportation. We saw incredible acceleration of some trends already in play. At a high level, it's the technology and changes in customer expectations that are driving a lot of the drama. Changing customer expectations can be seen in the e-com trends and methods for delivery of goods. Transportation modes have been affected in very different ways. All the modes have gone through some wrenching changes. Air freight's belly capacity essentially disappeared with the elimination of most travel, while the demand surged. On the other hand, private fleets were the heroes for many companies, and savvy fleet managers were able to upgrade their fleets sooner than planned. Of course, you've heard of the latest disruption in ocean freight with the Suez Canal blockage. Thankfully, they got it busted loose yesterday, but it exacerbated an already problematic lack of demand or capacity. And truckload is also struggling with capacity in the form of both equipment and driver shortages. So global e-commerce revenues that were already projected for a huge 12 to 15% annual growth rate saw a 25% growth rate in 2020 due to COVID. And in the US, the main reason consumers shopped online was for home delivery. An important impact for all of this for shippers on their delivery network design and infrastructure. So the location, size, and function of warehouses, retail locations, and even manufacturing locations has been affected. Both individuals and businesses expect to get goods faster, more flexibly, and with visibility in transit. We'll talk more in a bit about the technologies that are supporting those trends. And with the exception of widely accepted surcharges for same-day, overnight, or expedited service, and customers expect low-cost delivery regardless of seasonal capacity constraints that might be faced by the carrier. Companies like Amazon keep raising the bar for customer expectations in both B2C and B2B with free shipping options. It's been tough for shippers to meet consumer delivery demands without overspending on transportation. Customers now expect low-cost, personalized service with real-time visibility, most critically in the last mile before delivery. So we have this dramatic shift in customer expectations, and both shipper supply chains and carriers are scrambling to adjust. Okay, let's talk about some of the technologies and, more importantly, user adoption rates of those technologies. The graph here shows in dark green the current rate of adoption. The dark blue bar is what's expected in the next couple of years, and the other bars project out 3 to 6 years or more. Cloud storage at the top is all about accessibility and visibility. It's good that we're seeing high adoption rates here because this is the forerunner for adoption of other connected technologies that will eventually define the supply chain standards for the future. One of the fastest growing adoption rates is for inventory and network optimization tools. One of the biggest benefits is having a clear roadmap for operational decisions that'll work for the business, their customers, and the entire supply chain. In the warehouse, 63% of investment is currently focused on warehouse automation technologies. That's huge. This is everything from robotics to warehouse management systems. And while there's still human touch points, these technologies are speeding things up, increasing accuracy, and the primary reason Amazon is automating warehouse functions, reducing theft. Robots don't steal. The Internet of Things takes sensors to the next level. In the warehouse, tracking equipment in real time and integrating with the WMS smartens the picking process, and the goal of realizing end-to-end inventory tracking from origin to the delivery doorstep is within reach. Gartner forecasts that AI, or automated intelligence, is going to add up to $2.9 trillion of business value in 2021. In supply chain, logistics service providers and 3PLs are bringing AI into decision support. The findings show that 56% of LSPs and 3PLs are planning to increase investments in predictive planning and demand forecasting. Again, the goal is to improve visibility into network constraints and bottlenecks and deal with them before they happen.
Arvind, if I can actually just interrupt you for 1 second as I look at this list. Maybe two questions sort of about this same list of things. When you look at these technologies, where have you seen a few where procurement organizations are potentially getting involved to help in sourcing the technologies that fall in these categories? And which of these categories end up producing data feeds that you have seen procurement and supply chain teams pull into either BI platforms or different types of data analytics systems?
Sure. The WMS, the TMS systems, those are all, they've been around a long time. A lot of companies have them. And that's one area that really helps to automate the sourcing ultimately of transportation. Of course, we're helping companies with sourcing their telematics for their trucks and things like that as well.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So autonomous delivery vehicles are not only seeing intense investment, but they're also set to see a huge increase in user acceptance. The technology has been operational for years. Remember the Budweiser beer run back in 2016 that hauled a full truckload of beer 120 miles to Colorado Springs without any human intervention. But people just haven't been ready for it on a large scale. I think it's interesting that while more than half of Americans would not feel safe in a driverless vehicle, more than half of small business owners believe their fleets will be fully autonomous in 20 years. And then the last one is blockchain. While it's in the early stages of adoption and development for supply chain, expect to see more and more of it in the upcoming years. Remember, blockchain is a secure distributed ledger, meaning it can do exchange, agreements, or tracking processes in a totally secure manner. In supply chain, that can apply to anything from self-executing supply contracts to automated cold chain management. It really is a whole new world out there, and not only the incredible rate of technological development, but the increasing rate of adoption of these technologies. Okay. So the combination of the changing customer expectations and the technological developments has turned transportation sideways and upside down in many cases. Let's start the discussion with trucking. Trucking rates have seen huge volatility over the years. I like the Coyote logistics analysis on the left because it shows the relative rate change compared to the same season in previous cycles. The green line here shows the change in truckload spot market rates. They've reached record highs this year, but appear to have finally leveled off. Expect them to continue to come off the recent highs. On the other hand, contract rates, the blue line, they're on an upward trend, and they're expected to rise until capacity reaches equilibrium with demand. And the gray bars there represent Class 8 tractor orders. Here we can see that relative demand was falling until the global shutdown, and then orders shot up. Of course, it takes a while to make a truck, so there's a lag before that capacity shows up on the market. Truck manufacturing prices in December 2020 were at the 5-year record. At that point, they were about 3% above the 5-year average. Expect equipment costs to rise also with the increasing pressure to go electric and the low emissions vehicles. And then there's the chip and parts shortages. That's slowing production and increasing costs. Some of this is impacted by the ocean container situation that we'll talk about in a minute. U.S. diesel fuel prices, they tanked with the onset of the global shutdown and remained low for most of 2020. But the days of low fuel appear to be over, though prices this year have shot back up to rates that we haven't seen since 2018. This year, operators saw a 50% jump in fuel prices in some areas. And while GDP goods transport was up 85% in the third quarter of last year, more than making up for earlier losses, the industry lost a lot of drivers last year. There was a high number of retirements, and many left for new local delivery jobs that popped up or construction. The additional training and requirements for COVID protection also slowed the process to bring new drivers on. Competition for drivers is still extremely high. Compared to last February, this year there are nearly 3 times the number of truck driver jobs posted on job boards, but there are fewer drivers searching for the jobs. And the $1.9 trillion stimulus package signed on March 11th will likely remove more people from the job market. We're already seeing lowered applications for driving jobs. Making the situation worse is the uncertain future of owner-operators. In California, a state law known as AB 5 that would largely treat owner-operators as company employees is being challenged in court. But in the meantime, Schneider, the second largest U.S. truckload carrier, already has stopped using California domiciled owner-operators until the issue is settled. Then we have the Partisan PRO Act, or the Protecting Right to Organize Act of 2021 that just passed in the U.S. House. It would classify a worker as an employee of the company unless that worker performs a service outside the usual course of the business for the employer. To counter that, there's a bill in West Virginia, the West Virginia Senate, that broadly protects the owner-operator model and specifically enables motor carriers to require safety improvements on their independent contractors without being held liable as an employer. And while all this is going on, autonomous vehicles are making swift strides to fill in that driver gap.
Margaret, as you pause, quick question for you from Nick. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in the driver shortage and what the options are. Maybe driverless vehicles, right, over time will come in and fill that gap between supply and demand. But in the short term, have you seen any interesting best practices from carriers and fleet operators in terms of how they address the driver shortage?
I have, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the
Excellent.
presentation, but great question. Thank you, Nick. First of all, I want to talk about what's happening in ocean freight. So there's been a prolonged bottleneck situation on the Trans-Pacific trade route for some time. A combination of a few things has exacerbated this situation. First, there was a surge in demand in the second half of last year after the lockdowns eased up. Then lower productivity in US import terminals on the West Coast versus the productivity of the Asian loading terminals, combined with working restrictions coinciding with seasonal holidays, it all produced an enormous backup of ships at the West Coast ports. Pre-2020, there might be 1 or 2 ships waiting at the berth of the Port of LA. In January, there were up to 35 vessels waiting, and it was still at more than 25 last week. So there are virtually no idle ships right now. They're all full. And then you've got inland rail delays. They're also exacerbating the container shortage. And I'm sure you've been hearing about the Suez Canal situation. The Suez Canal in Egypt handles around 12% of the global seaborne trade. And about half of the traffic going through there is container ship traffic. They just dislodged the Ever Given ship after almost a week of total blockage. And each day of total blockage disrupted more than $9 billion worth of goods in transit. And there's still more than 300 vessels backed up at either end. And while a lot of that is the EU to Asia trade and oil related, any significant slowing of container traffic can have a global effect in container capacity. The Wall Street Journal noted that rerouting freight around Africa or through the Panama Canal reduces the global container shipping capacity by 6%. To put it in perspective, it's a 3,000-mile reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, and dozens of ships are already committed to that. Youch. To make things worse, ocean carriers took capacity out of the market in early 2020 as demand initially fell due to the global shutdown, and COVID fears reduced the port capacity. So scrapping ships goes a lot faster than building them, and it takes years to rebuild that capacity that they lost. So orders for new ships over the past 6 months have been predominantly for the larger 12,000, 15,000, 24,000 TEU class ships, with essentially no interest for mid-sized tonnage. That does limit also port capacity, because you have to have a port big enough to accept those monster ships. This capacity crunch is happening right when demand is up. Consumers have replaced demand for travel and dining out with demand for retail goods, goods that largely come from overseas versus local food and local services. Retail purchases are expected to continue at 5 to 8% above the pre-pandemic levels, and that drives ocean freight demand. Another factor is that inventories were dramatically reduced in 2020. Those inventories remain suppressed, so restocking demand is also driving up container demand. Unfortunately, the high demand will continue to drive a preference for the Pacific Coast ports for the Asian imports destined for the Midwest, because it takes 41 days longer to get to the Gulf ports via Asia it takes 41 days to get to the Gulf ports versus 20 days to the West Coast. So it's 21 days longer. And then the relationship of NVOCCs and VOCCs, that's the vessel operating companies versus the non-vessel operating companies. That's changing as Maersk directly enters the freight forwarding business. So the longer term impacts of this shift are not clear, but I know that NVOCCs are scrambling to diversify their capacity, and they're even purchasing some ships. Okay, now we're going to talk about air freight. So the grinding halt to travel last year also pinched the small package capacity, because it was the belly of the passenger planes that provided reasonably priced capacity to the market. That capacity is slowly rebounding, but likely won't reach previous levels for the foreseeable future. So there was a rush to repurpose passenger planes as cargo planes, and that helped alleviate some of the capacity crunch. Of course, it also added to the underlying cost. Small package carriers, they've been steadily increasing pricing complexity and accessorial charges over the last few years. So the dimensional weight issue bit a lot of retail shippers with charges that escalated based on box dimensions for low weight shipments. This year saw dramatic increases in peak season surcharges. Any of you that had to ship an express package in December last year know exactly what I'm talking about. So last mile deliveries become the major focus for retail and small package. The omni-channel reality is driving investment in streamlining the last mile solutions. One interesting development in last mile delivery is that FedEx just ended their arrangement with USPS for last mile delivery. So you'll see SmartPost rebranded as FedEx Ground Economy, and they're providing full residential US coverage. Okay, and now we're going to talk about private and dedicated fleets. There we go. So the pandemic comes along and the market disruptions create uncertainty, rising rates, lack of capacity for shippers who were used to buying freight on the spot market, or even those with contracts that had competitive rates prior to the upheaval. As we saw earlier, spot rates climbed to record levels and the balance of lanes was completely tossed in the air. So suddenly you couldn't get carriers to go to California, for example. If you're a retailer with one of your major DCs in the LA area, this was really problematic. I know some retail and food delivery chains that immediately turned to buying equipment and hiring drivers, or increased their dedicated fleet operations simply to secure capacity. Another trend already in play that was accelerated in 2020 is the increase in the used vehicle market. So this applies to fleet pickup trucks as well as the Class 8 trucks. Prior to 2020, private fleet managers had accelerated replacement of their fleet for reasons like getting reduced emissions vehicles and to upgrade to the latest technology advancements. They've been selling equipment sooner, so there's more available in the used vehicle market. The equipment isn't as old and it's more advanced, so the prices have also risen. And in addition, the shorter buying cycle of the new vehicles ensures a steady increase in the supply of used trucks. Buying a used truck involves lower investment than purchasing a new vehicle. So a big increase in demand, higher quality, higher prices, steady supply means that the used truck market is rapidly growing. For those buying new equipment, they have their own challenges. Remember the chip and part shortages I mentioned earlier. This is slowing down the delivery timing and capacity of the OEMs. Deliveries of new orders right now are running up to months longer than usual. So there was a surge in demand for private fleets as the consumers shifted towards e-commerce. The industry was already facing driver shortages, and this was compounded by the need for additional delivery drivers when local restaurants moved into the delivery space. At the same time, for some fleets, business dried up overnight, especially those servicing national restaurant chains and food service distributors. Up to 50% of their business disappeared within 2 weeks. So this forced a widespread reorganization of services, focusing on the increased demand from grocery and e-commerce. That side of the business couldn't keep up with demand, and we saw some empty store shelves until the fleets were rebalanced. But one thing is clear, the companies who are staying flexible, developing contingency plans and strategies, those are the ones that are going to thrive as we shoot through these rapids. Okay. So long overlooked logistics functions are now a strategic priority for a lot of companies. Next, we'll talk about some focus areas for optimal logistics performance. So these 4 areas are intricately related, and a shipper is best served if they consciously and strategically coordinate their efforts. A strategic logistics organization will look very different from industry to industry and company to company, but the thing they have in common is that at the highest levels of the organization, they'll agree on the strategic importance of logistics and provide executive mandate to lead the company according to the strategy. Note that a strategic logistics organization may include outsourcing. An in-depth assessment of the overall corporate goals, existing capabilities, and desired end state is a prerequisite for a truly strategic logistics organization. Once the goals are established, the organization can focus on optimizing the network. Here, we look at the footprint of the company, intelligent forecasting, and multimodal optimization. Mode-specific transportation sourcing is intertwined with the network optimization, being both an input to the network modeling and a result of the decisions made through the process. And if private fleet is part of the strategy, the most important areas to focus on will be the equipment sourcing strategy, maintenance, and driver retention, which we're going to talk about in a little while. All right. So 2020 was an eye-opener for organizations to ensure that logistics are a prioritized part of the overall business strategy. It's finally becoming clear that an optimized supply chain not only maintains operations to keep business flowing, but it also contains costs and may even provide a competitive advantage. So we're seeing organizations shifting away from cost minimization in logistics and towards strategic value creation. The all-important investment assessment phase should be a brutally honest look at your corporate goals, internal capabilities, and external market trends. You need the answers to some questions to make a good decision on the org structure. First, what level of skills does your team have? Can they be trained? Can you hire for the skills you need? A skills gap is one of the most common reasons for outsourcing to a 3PL. Next, how complex is the regulatory climate in your business? Global shipments require collaboration with various countries while staying compliant with local rules. And there can be hundreds of regulations in each country. And the trick is to stick to the rules while making sure you aren't spending time and money on needless actions. What level of detail is needed for inbound raw material visibility or customer deliveries? If inbound visibility is crucial to keeping your lines running and avoiding shutdowns, then you'll benefit from having some tracking capabilities. If you lose the trust of your customers with inaccurate or non-existent package monitoring, then you can't afford to not have a tracking system. Do you need a TMS to store your lane rates and tender loads? What about a WMS or other technology that you don't currently have in-house? So the cost of developing a system in-house, training and managing it can be daunting, from a change management perspective. On the other hand, if delivery is core to your business, it may be worth the effort and cost to develop it in-house. So answers to these questions will tell you if you should make investment in developing or honing internal skills. Some companies choose to use a 3PL so that they can focus on their core business. Now, I've worked with companies to quickly upgrade skills and put in a functioning TMS by using a 3PL, but this was just the first step in the process. Once the processes and systems were in place and running smoothly, then they were able to take their time in hiring and bringing the management piece back in-house. And for companies, if that makes sense in the long term, the 3PL can be a good short-term step. If you do go to a 3PL route, be sure to keep critical management functions in-house. Don't outsource it all. You need visibility. So a clearly defined agreement, it includes specific service levels and consequences for not meeting them. Any questions on that?
I don't believe so, but this is a good time to remind everybody that any questions that you've had as we go through, or certainly that you have from this point forward, go ahead and type those into the Q&A as you have them, and we will have some time with Margaret to do questions at the end. But thank you for pausing.
No problem. So network optimization covers a wide range of efforts. This can be a spreadsheet analysis for smaller or less complex networks, or it might require the use of specialized software like LlamaSoft and a team of optimization experts to model complex or very granular network issues. The case example here had intermediate complexity, and we developed the model using Access database programming. So this is a nationwide retail chain with 6 regional distribution centers, and they were facing rapidly rising transportation rates and deteriorating service. First, we modeled the current network, including DC labor, facility costs, shipment sizes, and frequency and rate estimates for the various modes. And yes, we did site visits, talked with the warehouse, fleet and transportation managers to get their perspective and understand their pain point. Then we developed several possible future scenarios, including reducing or repurposing the DC. The current capacity of the DCs as well as expansion capability was taken into account. So to be confident that our model was realistic, we put all of the traffic in an RFP to the carrier market. This included existing traffic plus the potential new lanes that would support the alternate scenarios. The company's dedicated fleet was modeled and analyzed for possible changes as well. Now, the carriers were notified that not all of the lanes would be awarded, and we discussed the alternate scenarios in the carrier negotiations. Ultimately, we were able to take $4.5 million out of the cost by rationalizing the locations. The new network had 8% fewer shipments because of the repurposing of a third of the DCs. Essentially, we consolidated the inbound to fewer major DCs and were able to better fill intra-company shipments to the supporting DCs. This affected 40 vendors who now ship to fewer locations with higher volume shipments. And we were able to ship higher cost LTL to better utilize truckload. There was also some reassignment of store deliveries by the DC for some of the more remote locations, and we were even able to use common carriers for some of those deliveries. This same process can be used to determine not only the optimal use of your existing facilities, but to evaluate a greenfield scenario. Once it's set up, it can also be used to determine a long-term strategy for facility location and sizing using different demand projections. Of course, many companies are turning to localization as a risk mitigation strategy, driven by the uncertain trade situation between China and the US. Network modeling can help you avoid some very costly mistakes here. So other organizations are working to establish deeper, more collaborative relationships with their transportation and tech providers to forecast capacity and gain better visibility over the supply chain. To improve supply chain resilience, retailers and consumer goods companies in particular, they need better visibility into network constraints and bottlenecks, as well as having access to additional channels to avoid blockages. A recent report shows that more than half of the companies in these two sectors plan to increase investment in predictive planning and demand forecasting. Very smart and much needed. Before 2020, retailers were already pressured to fulfill digital orders faster. So two trends here are micro fulfillment, or the placement of smaller warehouses closer to the end consumer, and companies using their own stores as fulfillment centers.
Margaret, quick question for you on this case study. Debbie asks a question, and it's so funny. Debbie, thank you for asking this question because it reminds me of sourcing LTL back in the day. She's asking the role of sourcing technology in these very complicated projects, not only in terms of bringing in the bids and managing all the suppliers, but then in handling the optimization itself. Any recommendations or takeaways from you on the sourcing technology component of a project like this?
Sure, that's a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I actually helped develop some of the very first bid optimization tools back in the day. And those tools have gone through a lot of transformation, and that's you could do a whole webinar on that in and of itself. So, there are numerous bid optimization technologies, and you really need to look into their specific capabilities and capacities today. I know EVOS Logistics has one that's specifically for truckload transportation and very complex problems where you might have hundreds of bidders, thousands of lanes, and several different scenarios like we're talking about going on. So I can follow up with anyone who has questions about bid tools and bid optimization. Good question. Okay. And leads right into the transportation sourcing. So I'm sure I don't have to tell you that with today's volatility, it's imperative that you have strong relationships with your third-party carriers, as well as some robust contingency plans. Here are a few areas for consideration in your transportation sourcing strategy. So it's really hard to know if you're getting a good deal on your transportation rates and services, and benchmarking can be an excellent way to get a feel for that. Unfortunately, in wildly volatile times like these, finding good benchmarks can be really challenging. So using advisors with the experience is your best bet, but don't forget to use internal benchmarks across your organization if you have different groups purchasing like services. Of course, if your carriers aren't giving you the capacity at your contracted rates, or you see that your spot rates are going ballistic, you know that you're out of step with the market. On the other hand, in times like these, if your carriers aren't asking for increases, you were probably paying too much all along. So one enduring principle of strategic sourcing is to leverage your spend. And I'm always surprised at how few companies actually do this. So oftentimes each lane is bid as coverage is needed. Regional or mini bids can be useful between leveraged sourcing events, but you never get the results from a mini bid that you can see in a fully leveraged RFP. Including inbound freight and longer haul freight from your dedicated or private fleet reveals new opportunities that your carriers can use to fill in holes in their network or create bundles of traffic that keep truck utilization up. Even those dog and cat tough to service or remote lanes benefit in a leveraged event. It's easier to get a carrier to service the unattractive freight if you're dangling millions of dollars in a potential award. Here's a big prize, but they also have to take this over here to get it. So in any sourcing, fact-based negotiations are the most powerful. Let the data be your guide is a good motto. The more information you have about your traffic, service requirements, driver requirements, your carrier's past performance, and what others are willing to offer, the better the negotiations will go. Simply put, information and clarity reduce risk. Carriers will build in a cushion if they feel the commitment is unclear. So this is one of the largest drivers of being able to reach stretch goals in compliance. Having an experienced team sourcing team, they'll prepare your leaders for the negotiations. That's really important. We usually develop a negotiation guide that draws in historic spend and performance, current bids, competitive options. And then the bid optimization tools, they can provide as many detailed scenarios for analysis as needed. And it's a good idea to review those potential scenarios with your carriers during the negotiations. And the only way that you're going to ensure compliance to your new agreements is by measuring performance. Be sure that you're measuring what matters with your carriers. That's another area we could go on and on about, but we'll leave it at that for now. So private or dedicated fleets support critical business functions and might be the primary means of delivering to customers, transporting your employees, or ensuring safety in the function of core business operations. Today, we're going to focus on 3 areas of fleet management. The acquisition aspect of fleet, it's at the core of a sound transportation strategy. Strategies will vary widely based on the industry, the size of the organization, and the purpose of the fleet. Organizations might choose to lease, buy, or take a hybrid approach when building out their fleet. But the first step, again, is to conduct an assessment that clearly outlines the purpose of the fleet, financial goals, the risks, the stakeholders. The assessment should address several areas. First of all, specifications of the unit should align to the overall purpose of the fleet. Be very clear on must-haves versus nice-to-haves. And when you're establishing specs, consider the total cost of ownership over the lifetime of a unit, including maintenance and replacement costs. If owned equipment fits your overall strategy, periodic strategic sourcing events can maximize your spend leverage, that is, lower the costs, and provide an opportunity to improve warranties and service guarantees at the same time. Be sure to include that in your negotiations. And if you're leasing, it's important to determine if the units in the fleet are capital lease or an operating lease. And full service leases should be evaluated based on your internal maintenance capability and service profile. So a thorough analysis of maintenance versus replacement costs can help you determine the exact timing to replace the older vehicles and minimize overall costs. Ongoing awareness of the used vehicle markets is fundamental to this strategy. In 2020, like we mentioned, savvy fleet owners who paid close attention to the new versus used vehicle markets, they were able to upgrade their fleets for very small cost when the price for used vehicles shot up much more than the increase in the price for new vehicles. Maintenance is another critical aspect of the fleet strategy. There's a few items to consider when evaluating fleet maintenance. A thorough part strategy will take into account the needs of your end users, mechanics, and clerks. You may have in-house mobile mechanics, but there's usually a need for third-party mechanics. Positive service provider relationships are based on good communication and providing visibility of your needs. As a minimum, determine whether the current maintenance plan meets the manufacturer recommendations. And active management of warranties, that can generate millions of dollars in annual savings for a sizable fleet. And then to the question about drivers, to ensure that drivers are complying with the established maintenance policies, you need a tracking mechanism for your fleet. Telematics, the use of technology to control and monitor vehicles, that's a growing method for preventative maintenance that reduces breakdowns and those costly repairs. Now, if you're in the transportation business, you know that driver shortage is a long-term issue. Until we get full acceptance of fully automated vehicles, you'll want to have a comprehensive driver retention program. So it's always a good idea to get driver feedback on solutions. It not only keeps your eye on the reality they deal with, but it keeps them engaged and motivated. And last mile drivers, they're high in demand. They're typically not treated well. So you have to make up for that with compensation, benefits, recognition. Now, remember that bonus schemes for on-time delivery can encourage unsafe behavior. But driver scorecards based on telematics, they foster better driving behaviors. So, and if logos are on your delivery vehicles, your drivers are your brand ambassadors. Be sure they understand that and that they're treated accordingly. So fleet strategies not only play a role in the utilization of the fleet, but the productivity of operations as a whole. Taking time to develop a sound fleet strategy pays dividends. Okay, any questions?
We do actually have a few questions that have come in. First of all, thank you, Margaret. I mean, this is, even when you think about all the different channels that are included in something like logistics, this category is a bear. So well done for providing us with such a thorough overview, really, in just like 45 minutes. We covered a ton of ground, and we have some really interesting questions that have come in. We'll have about 10 minutes. If anybody has been on the fence, go ahead and get those questions in now. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A box. One question that came in that I'll actually answer while we give Margaret a chance to catch her breath is whether a recording of this session will be available on demand. The simple answer is yes, it absolutely will be. It will be up shortly inside of the AOP Mastermind community. If you don't currently have access to that, the best thing to do is to go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind, and you will find out how to get access to that community where videos like this one and others are stored on demand. But more materially, I think of the questions that we've gotten in, Margaret, there are a couple that jump out at me as being really interesting. One is from Nick, and it's interesting how it applies to logistics, but I think it definitely plays into a larger procurement topic right now, which is supplier experience. So when he's talking more narrowly about carrier relationships, how companies are starting to view their relationships with these carriers, perhaps if they took an overly cost focus in the past, those relationships might be, transactional at best, adversarial at worst. Any best practices, recommendations, trends that you've noticed around companies either having better relationships with their carriers or trying to improve situations where perhaps they found themselves in a bind last year, having difficulty finding capacity, and they're trying to turn a reputation around with the carrier market?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing that I'll say is there's different types of carriers. Some carriers are interested in deeper relationships with the shippers and joint process improvements, and some carriers are out for the highest buck. So, that's why a strategic sourcing effort is really helpful to sort of separate them out and figure out, who are the carriers you want to have a relationship. So a robust RFI, or request for information, can kind of get to that, but really it isn't until you sit down with some of them and talk to them. So we always have, well, it used to be face-to-face meetings, now I guess it's Zoom meetings with the suppliers, but there's nothing like that interaction to chat and talk with them. And we always ask questions about what is your overall corporate goals, what is your culture like at your company, to understand. So first of all, you have to find the carriers that are looking for that kind of deep relationship. If you've been a shipper who has mostly worked on the spot market to go after the low rates and you jump from carrier to carrier, it can be a tough reputation to overcome. But you overcome that by, first of all, training your folks internally that we're doing things different. And this can be a tough transition, right? Because some folks are like, they're doing their best. They're trying to save a buck. They have an agreement here with the carrier at this rate, but gosh, on the spot market, I could get 50 bucks less. So I'm going to go to somebody else there. And that really undermines those carrier relations. So the TMS systems can really help with that. That's where automation does help.
Yeah.
You have the personal touch in the sourcing where you get to know these people, you get it set up, you go through the implementation, and then you have tools that automatically will tender loads to the right carriers in the right order. And that can go a long way to build trust with them.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other question, we're getting some really deep questions here today. The other question is from Sarah, and she's inquiring about when you were discussing the complexity of the optimization scenarios. She shares that at her organization in the past, sourcing something like LTL would have been predominantly a cost or efficiency based exercise. Whereas now they're looking at it also in terms of risk mitigation, minimization, awareness, all of that as well. What are you seeing around either how companies are structuring these bids or in terms of the constraints and assumptions they're building in? So are you seeing a different approach to the decision-making process? Are you seeing more willingness to pay a little bit more in order to split a lane and maybe have some backup capacity as risk becomes increasingly a focus? Obviously, we don't want to let cost go, but what are you actually seeing that shift from a business decision perspective?
Well, those observations are right on. And many of those things we've been working with our clients to develop over the years as risk mitigation strategies. So oftentimes, if we're talking about a big truckload program, we'll split lanes so that we have two major carriers. If it's a big lane, we can give, carrier A 5 loads a day and carrier B 5 loads a day instead of all 10 loads to one carrier. That can be a really a good way to help mitigate. And then if one carrier can't handle it, the other one can. So splitting the awards is a good strategy. Another strategy is to put backup carriers in place. We always look to award a sizable award as a primary carrier to any carrier in our network, unless we have one who wants to only be a backup carrier. And sometimes that happens and works. But usually we'll say, look, here's your core business. We're going to guarantee you this. We're always going to tender these to you. And then you're going to back us up on these other lanes, maybe out of the same facility, but to destinations you aren't the primary on. And every so often, you give them a load there. You have to sort of keep it fresh. So it takes, it's complex in the awarding and the award scenarios to do that, but then that has to flow through to the tendering, the day-to-day tendering, so that you keep your options open. The truth is that's not always the lowest cost that you can go with. You might have to spend a little bit more, but that's your risk mitigation. So it's totally worth it.
Yeah. So I think we have time to sneak in 2 more questions. One is tricky, so we'll start there. And then the other one is very easy. The question coming in from Sean, and if you somehow or other manage to answer this question perfectly, we're just going to hire you for every single category. Sean's asking about uncertainty. And he's talking about the fact that in order to manage a complex bid in logistics, obviously, the more you know about your shipping requirements going forward, the more precise you can be in terms of award. And so he's asking for your advice about how companies that are putting any logistics category of spend out to bid, what should they use in terms of a visibility horizon? How far into the future should they attempt to be confident around what they're going to need in terms of capacity or even lanes? Or should they try to focus very specifically on a short window of time if they can get more certainty around that, and then give themselves the flexibility as they continue to watch the economy reopen?
Yeah, well, this is a tough question right now, right? I might have had a different question, a different answer a year ago.
Yeah.
And we're definitely struggling with this question these days. So, in ocean freight, where it's always been an annual deal, we've got companies saying, gee, can we do just a few months at a time to lock it in, because we have no idea what's going to happen out in the future. So you do want to be flexible with different things like that might sort of be a tangent from how the market normally operates. Ocean freight is a tough one these days. So I think that's one option. But what we always do is try to look into the future. Usually a bid will say, here's what we did last year, that's what we're going to bid out. Because it's not easy to get forecasts and build that in. And that's why it is also nice to have some help when you're doing a major bid, because everybody still has their day-to-day job to do. And this is another whole job on top of it, to get those forecasts, to understand what are the different potential scenarios. And like I said, when you're looking at network optimization, we might bid out 3 or 4 different scenarios, with lanes that may or may not ever come to fruition. Now, we label them as such. We let the carriers know we're looking at these different things, and then we sit down and talk to them. So it's a big, complex effort, but if you do it, you can get carriers to have that longer term vision and say, okay, I'm willing to do this today with this company because I know that they have this plan to build out these new DCs, to change this, and that new traffic is a sweet spot for me. So I'm going to get in and help them today. That's the kind of conversation you want to have with your carriers.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, you definitely earned your easy question. So we always like to wrap with, for any of the folks, and we do actually have some other comments and questions that I don't have time to get to as we're getting to the top of the hour. Thank you to Peter and Meredith and everybody who offered up their comments and questions here. But if folks who are here now with us live, or folks that are watching this on demand, would like to get in touch and ask you a question or get your feedback on something, and you even knocked my easy question out of the park. This is the best way for folks to get in touch with you then, I assume.
That's right. That's right. All my information is there. I'm always happy to talk about supply chain. So please reach out, give me a call, drop an email. This was a lot of fun, and I love to just chat with folks about what their challenges are, and I'm glad to do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today, Margaret. I appreciate your time. We've all learned a ton in the last hour. We can consider this our official celebratory logistics scheduling that the Ever Given is free. Thank you as well to everybody that joined us from the Art of Procurement and the Mastermind community. As I said, this will be available on demand. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Kelly.